Welcome back to Alpacamade. It's good to see you again. It's Saturday, February 22nd, 2020. In other social media platforms, you might hear me going on about abandoned explorers, and maybe you'd like to know why I am always doing that. This picture is of a converted mansion that is no longer in my hometown. Some people who know me will recognize it right away. It was a private psychiatric hospital. It would have been called a sanitarium at the time, but there was no medical patients there, no tuberculosis recovery or anything like that. It was strictly alcoholism and related problems for wealthy people. And so my mother worked there when I was a very little girl, 2, 3 years old, and she worked overnight, so she would drop me off at a neighbor's house whose husband was the janitor. And when I would smell perking coffee and frying bacon in the morning, I knew it was time for my mother to come and get me. So I went there a couple of times at Christmas time. The staff would get together and bake cookies for the patients, and they would have a fancy Christmas tea. So somewhere in my box of stuff, there's a picture of me and my mother and her girlfriend sitting behind a table with 52 dozen cookies for one of these fancy teas. Now, I didn't really get to go exploring too much when I was a little girl. My mother wouldn't let me out of her sight. But trust me, there were all kinds of cupboards and nooks and crannies that any kid would have loved to explore if their mom wasn't so watchful. So I want to take you on a little tour of Detroit and then maybe a half a dozen shots of other places in Michigan. Detroit has been an abandoned explorer's paradise for a very long time. We're talking almost 40 years. Beautiful old churches, the abandoned car factories, Packard plant, Fisher Body, and some other places. But they've all been done because abandoned exploring was really a hot thing back in the 70s and 80s and early 90s in Detroit. Now there are so many renovation projects. Thank God some of this stuff got reclaimed. But the places are just either so trashed or so dangerous that it's all been done, including there's a massive tunnel system in the Wayne County, which is where Detroit is. There are salt mines under Detroit, and some of those salt mines are being used now as cold storage. And as you can see, there are all kinds of reclamation projects, including the famous Heidelberg project, and this shot belongs to Park West Gallery. That neighborhood actually has been turned into an arts neighborhood. This is the last shot from Detroit for now. These are two guys exploring one of the old tunnel entrances in Wayne County. Many of them have been blocked up by now, but there is still a vast tunnel system. And when explorers and commenters talk about the light, it truly is all about the light. Let's zoom up to Upper Michigan and take a look at the shaft entrance at the abandoned Hiawatha iron ore mine in Iron River, Michigan, and then you can explore the abandoned ore dock in Marquette, Michigan, and then look who showed up. Imagine my surprise when in the middle of a huge page of places in Michigan with Michigan explorers, here's Josh. Exploring with Josh was at a copper baron's mansion in Wales, and somehow Google thought that was the same thing as being in a copper mine in Upper Michigan. It's not. Thanks, Josh. Fun to see you again. Carry on. We're going to the copper mine in Upper Michigan. There are several copper mines in Upper Michigan, and not all of them can be explored because some of them are still private property. Nevertheless, some can be explored, and you can also go see our beautiful pictured rocks any time of the year, but if you go in the winter, you can go ice climbing. Before we leave Upper Michigan, people who don't live in our region of the United States don't realize how huge the water system is of the Great Lakes and Canada. And in Michigan, there has been a project to reclaim and refurbish the old lighthouses. Now let's turn the corner and go back downstate, back to southeast Michigan, to a little community called Irish Hills just outside of Ann Arbor, and these are the Irish Hills Towers. Fancy an abandoned theme park? Well, while you're in Irish Hills, there is a kitschy old prehistoric forest with real sort of 50s style dinosaurs. I do have to caution you, this is on private property, so you might want to do some checking before you just go traipsing around with a camera. This is one of the places I promised my kids when they were very little that we would go see, and sadly, we never got there. Before we leave the more rural parts of Michigan, I just wanted to pop this up here. Not too far from where I live is a big field where a farmer has made interesting use of his old farm equipment in the form of sculpture. And it's hard to tell from this picture, but those are not toys. We haven't even scratched the surface of what is out of the way on the highways and byways in Michigan, but we're returning to Detroit to see the oldest neighborhood in the city, Corktown. And in visiting Corktown, we are kind of returning to my childhood. This is the old Tiger Stadium in the background. This is a historic, more than 100-year-old landmark, and it sits there and languishes because nobody can figure out what to do with it. Nobody wants it torn down, and nobody is willing to renovate it. So gone are the days when you could sit on the roof of a pub down in Corktown and watch the ball game. Gone are the days when a really good, well-hit home run would go sailing over the wall and down into the Corktown neighborhood. And even the stunningly beautiful Art Deco building, the Book Cadillac building, almost succumbed to the wrecking ball before it too was rescued by one of the big three auto companies. I would be remiss and probably shunned by every Michigan explorer if I didn't bring you this. This is the Michigan Central train station, which has been out of commission now for more than 30 years. There is talk and some negotiations that it has been finally sold for $90 million for redevelopment. We'll see what happens in the future, and we'll also see a shot of the interior with its massive marble columns that look like tree trunks. But for right now, I want to return to my story and my childhood so that you get a better idea of why I think and feel the way I do about abandoned explorers. And while I do that, I'm going to start running credits along the side screen because there were a lot of explorers whose shots I used and I want them to get credit for it. And so I hope I got everybody. If I didn't, I sincerely apologize. This is the Eastern Michigan Insane Asylum or Sanitarium. Yes, we're back to sanitariums again. And the reason I remember this place is because when I was a young girl, I took dancing lessons, and every spring before our final recital, we would do a charity show. Our dance teacher always booked us in at what was then called the Pontiac um, Mental Hospital, I think, or insane asylum. It might have still been insane asylum. And this is how I would have remembered it, even though I would have remembered it in the spring and not the winter. And as you can see, the grounds of this asylum were massive. It was built in 1897 and it was decommissioned, I think, in the late 70s or early 80s, but it was not actually torn down until 2000. When I was a kid and I wasn't in school and I wasn't at dance lessons and I wasn't outside playing, I spent a lot of time reading, more than my peers. And so when I needed a mental picture of what an asylum was, I had one. Books took me all over the world, to every continent, to every culture, and every time frame. So I understood, for example, what a Doric column was, like we see in this interior shot from the Michigan Central train station. But unfortunately, what we also see is a massive amount of graffiti and destruction. And now that you know a little bit about my background, you understand maybe why this angers me so much. In the United States, we have trespassing laws, and so a lot of these abandoned sites are not legally available to us, even though there's a huge contingent who still explore abandoned properties even today. All of the explorers that I know never take things, never vandalize the property, never break into the property, don't spray graffiti all over the place, and leave only their footprints in the dust. They are not silly teenagers setting up seances and Ouija boards and 3 a.m. challenges. They're not staging what they find in the places they investigate. Most of the time when they go someplace, they don't know what they're going to find. So the graffiti on the walls is not because of them. Now, I want to say one thing about staging. I am not of the opinion that you should never touch anything, that you should never open a cupboard or look inside a book or look at a photo album or that kind of thing. And the reason I say that is because in the professional world, when you are an anthropologist or an archaeologist or a historian or a documentarian, which many of these guys actually are, and I'll address that in a minute, that's exactly what you do. You open books, you look at record albums, you look at photo albums, you notice the details so that you can work out what the history of the place you're in might be. That's the whole point of those professions. I don't have any problem with somebody taking something and turning it so it gets better light, or taking something off the table so that a grouping on the table looks coherent. That's not a problem. Just put it back where you found it. That's all. In some very real ways, the explorers that I follow with their high ethical standards are professionals, because the difference between a professional and an amateur is whether you get paid or not. So you can be a paid professional and have amateur skills, but you can also be an amateur with professional skills. It's all in how you handle the job. So that shot of the sanitarium from when I was a little girl has been up there for a while, and it was to remind me that, to say to you that when I was a child, places like sanitariums, churches, even schools were special. They were places that were set aside for people who needed medical help or spiritual comfort or education. And so to set up, staged events and 3 a.m. challenges and Ouija boards is disrespectful in grown up. Teenagers are a different story. They still have not figured out what's real and what's not. I will leave you a list of the titles exactly as I found them in Google so that you can throw those titles in and find anything that I featured in this video on Abandon Explore. By the way, the name of that sanitarium where my mother worked, it was called the Haven. And in that spirit of the name, I'd like to say I hope there are always places to adventure and explore. I also hope that you will consider supporting them from time to time. Toss them $5, $10. I hope you enjoyed this look at Abandoned Exploring. I'd like to say thanks to Josh for his unexpected guest appearance by being in the middle of my Google search and adding a little humor into my Abandon Explore video.